Before Panzerschrecks, before Panzerfausts, before tank destroyers, Germany's first answer to combating tanks was a giant rifle, steel core bullets and bundled grenades. When the first British tanks first appeared out of the morning haze on the 15th of September 1916 at the Battle of the Somme, German soldiers had never seen anything like them. Rifle and machine gun bullets bounced off their armour, barbed wire was crushed beneath their tracks, and trenches that seemed impenetrable were now exposed. But within 2 years, Germany had adapted, turning field guns into tank killers, creating and distributing armour-piercing ammunition, and creating the world's first anti-tank rifle, the Mauser 1918 T Gewehr. But to get to this point, we have to go back to 1914 and understand why the tank was created in the first place. The First World War is often remembered as a brutal war, but often it's overlooked that it was also a war of innovation. The armies of both the Entente and the Central Powers rode into the war on cavalry in August of 1914, but by November of 1918, the victorious Entente would be riding out of it on tanks. This transformation was driven by the static deadlock of trench warfare that settled over the Western Front for 4 years. Military planners on both sides spent the next 4 years searching for ways to break the stalemate and restore a war of movement. Up until the Somme in 1916, both sides experimented with different methods: tunnelling and mining beneath enemy positions, massed frontal infantry assaults, relentless artillery bombardments against trenches and rear lines, and fighting for control of the skies with constantly evolving but yet still fragile aircraft. By this point, casualties had already reached into the millions, and if this rate of attrition continued unchanged, manpower shortages were inevitable. In Britain, one man, who would later be remembered in history for something further down the line, Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, championed the concept of the landship, what would later become the British Mark I tank. Armed with either 2 6-pounder naval guns or heavy machine guns, it was designed to break the stalemate of trench warfare, crushing barbed wire, crossing trenches, and knocking out exposed German machine gun positions. The first prototype tank, Little Willie, was built in July 1915 at the behest of the Landship Committee, and underwent field trials in autumn of the same year. By February 1916, an order of 150 Mark I tanks had been placed ahead of the planned British offensive that summer. The entire project was kept highly secret, and by September of 1916, although the Germans had slowed the British Somme offensive to a crawl, they had no real idea of the British plan to use their new weapon. The initial plan for the British was to deploy 49 Mark I tanks at Flers-Courcelette and break into the German lines and allow the infantry to pour into the gaps the tanks had created. However, there was one major issue with the Mark I that has to be mentioned. They were extremely mechanically unreliable. Of the 49 tanks shipped to France for the operation, only 36 reached their starting off positions. Of those, only 23 actually made contact with German infantry on that day, and by the beginning of the next day, all but 3 had broken down or been destroyed in combat. So whilst we've established that early tanks were far from perfect, the question remains, how did the Germans actually react? The popular image, often repeated lazily in schools and online history forums, is that German troops simply were so frightened and confused by the tank after finding out their machine guns and rifles weren't effective on its armour, ran away or surrendered. In reality, the situation was far more complex. Many German soldiers at Flers-Courcelette never even encountered tanks at all on the 15th, simply because so few made it to the German lines. However, the early performance of tanks being mechanically unreliable and tactically inconsistent also worked in Germany's favour. It allowed German forces to rapidly study and adapt to this new threat. Early German responses in 1916 were improvised, but artillery quickly became central to anti-tank defence and continued to do so till war's end, as the German doctrine moved from the attack to the defence on the Western Front. Standard field guns, especially the 77mm FK-96, were originally designed for indirect fire against infantry formations. However, crews rapidly adapted these weapons for direct fire roles when engaging tanks. German gunners developed a consistent firing doctrine. Priority targets were the tracks, running gear and steering sections of the tank. A mobility kill was often more tactically valuable than a full penetration. As a disabled tank could be isolated, surrounded and destroyed by infantry, or subjected to repeated artillery fire. When possible, crews also aimed at side armour or rear sections, where protection was weakest. Direct hits to these areas frequently resulted in catastrophic internal damage, crew casualties, or ignition of fuel and ammunition stores. One German soldier attached to the Field Artillery Regiment No. 13, who was present at Flers, later wrote home to his parents about his first encounter with a tank. Terrible hours lie behind me. I want to tell you some words about them. On the 15th of September, we have stalled an English attack, and amidst the most severe enemy fire, my guns fired 1,200 shells into the attacking English columns. Firing over open sights, we inflicted terrible casualties on them. We also destroyed an armoured automobile, armed with 2 quick-firing guns. It was curiously X-shaped, and powered by 2 enormous shovels which dug into the ground, pulling the vehicle along. The next immediate response was from German pioneers. Following the first British tank attacks at the Battle of Flers, German pioneers quickly analysed how tanks crossed trenches and obstacles. They identified that while early British tanks could traverse standard trench systems, their ability was limited by width and ground conditions, with German trenches being 2.5 metres wide in 1916. In response, trench lines were widened and deepened and given steeper reverse slopes to trap advancing vehicles. Special anti-tank ditches began appearing behind frontline positions, reaching about 4 metres in width and 2.5 metres in depth, creating layered obstacles rather than relying on a single trench. Pioneer units also reinforced shell-damaged terrain, leaving cratered ground untouched to increase the likelihood of tanks becoming ditched or bogged down. In some sectors, obstacles were deliberately arranged to funnel tanks into predictable routes, covered by artillery. Richard Hay, a British Army officer, remembers during the attack on Cambrai in late 1917 in his memoirs, Life in a Tank, about such a tactic. In the distance, we saw one of our tanks stuck in German wire, which at that point was about 100 yards thick. Smoke was belching from every porthole. A shell had registered a direct hit, exploding the petrol, and the tank was on fire. We dashed forward towards her. As early as October 1916, German command was already discussing how to counter tanks more effectively. Army Group Crown Prince Ruprecht issued the first official How to Combat Enemy Tanks guidance to frontline units. It stated clearly that rifle and machine gun fire was generally ineffective, and that single-hand grenades had little practical effect against armoured vehicles. It also noted that while bundle charges, grenades tied together, could be effective, they could only be used safely by experienced soldiers. Ultimately, it concluded that most reliable anti-tank weapons at the time still remained the 77mm field gun. So, within just a month of their first encounter with tanks, the Germans already had developed a doctrine for defeating them. One of the earliest infantry solutions was the Gebolt-Ladung, a bundle of hand grenades used to destroy or disable tank tracks. However, this weapon came with major risks. It was extremely dangerous to handle and only effective if placed directly on top of or underneath a tank. There's also the obvious risk of exposing yourself to bullets, shells and other battlefield dangers to plant this explosive charge. German tactics dictated that men armed with these explosive devices would lay in wait in narrow trenches, staying hidden until a tank would drive past, where they would rush out and attack the tank, taking advantage of its weak spots in the rear. The next major development came in June 1917 with the introduction of the armour-piercing K bullet. Firing from a standard Gewehr 98 rifle, this steel core round could penetrate approximately 6 to 12mm of armour, making it effective against early Mark I and II tanks. It also caused internal spalling, producing devastating injuries to tank crews. However, German infantry were often reluctant to use it. The altered ballistics, increased chamber pressure and rapid barrel wear made it unpopular. In some cases, it could even cause a catastrophic malfunction, damaging the rifle and injuring the shooter. Despite its early usefulness, the K-bullet quickly became obsolete by late 1917, as the introduction of the British Mark IV tank brought significantly thicker armour that rendered it largely ineffective. Once again, German forces were forced to go back to the drawing board. The Tankgewehr M1918, commonly referred to as the T-Gewehr, was Germany's first purpose-built anti-tank rifle and one of the most important infantry responses to armoured warfare during the First World War. Its introduction marked a shift from improvised anti-tank methods such as using artillery, bundle grenades and steel core ammunition to a dedicated weapon designed specifically to defeat tanks at close range. By 1917, Allied tanks such as the British Mark IV series were becoming increasingly common on the Western Front, and German infantry weapons were proving inadequate against them. Standard rifle fire, even with the earlier K-bullet, struggled against improving armour, and reliance on field artillery was not always practical in fast-moving engagements. In response, German ordnance engineers developed the Tankgewehr M1918, essentially scaling up the proven bolt-action system of the Gewehr 98 to fire a vastly more powerful cartridge. The T-Gewehr fired a massive 13.2 by 92mm cartridge, delivering enough kinetic energy to penetrate approximately 20mm of armour at short range. This made it capable of damaging the newer British tanks, particularly when targeting weaker side, rear or lower hull sections. Unlike earlier anti-tank attempts, the T-Gewehr gave German infantry a weapon that could engage armour from a relatively safe distance rather than requiring suicidal close-range attacks with explosives, or risking your fingers loading a K-bullet. In terms of design, the weapon was single shot and bolt action, prioritising power and simplicity over fire rate. It was extremely large and heavy, standing at 5 foot 7 inches and weighing over 18.5 kilograms, typically requiring a two-man crew. One firer and one assistant to carry ammunition and help reposition the weapon. The recoil was so severe, so strong, that it could shatter shoulder blades and break ribs if fired incorrectly. Later models would fix this by including a recoil pad to reduce the impact on the shoulder. Despite its effectiveness, the T-Gewehr was not without its problems. As previously mentioned, it was heavy, difficult to aim and produced significant barrel wear due to the extreme pressures of its cartridge. Nevertheless, it was widely issued from mid-1918 onward, producing around 14,500 units, and saw action during major Allied offensives in the final year of the war. The 37mm Rheinmetall TAC, Tankabwehrkanone, was the first attempt by any nation to design a weapon specifically for fighting tanks, marking a shift away from improvisation and toward dedicated anti-armour artillery during the final stages of the First World War. By 1917, it had become increasingly clear to German commanders that existing methods previously mentioned were struggling to keep pace with the development of Allied tanks. The Mark IV and later Mark V were becoming more reliable, better armoured and more widely used in coordinated assaults. In response, German industrial giants Rheinmetall and Krupp were asked by the OHL with developing a light mobile gun that could be issued directly to infantry units at the front. Rheinmetall's answer was the 37mm TAC, a compact anti-tank gun designed for direct fire engagements at relatively short range. Its projectile, a 37 by 94mm, was capable of penetrating approximately 15 to 20mm of armour under ideal conditions. While this level of penetration was sufficient to guarantee destruction of a tank from any angle, it was effective against thinner armour found on the back and sides of British tanks. In operational terms, the gun was designed to be as mobile as possible. It was typically served by a crew of 3 to 5 men, including a gunner, a loader, and ammunition bearers. This allowed it to be moved up and set up relatively quickly compared to heavier field artillery which required horses or mules. and it was often positioned in forward defensive zones, concealed in shell craters, trench edges or other covered positions where it could engage tanks at close range. Doctrine for its use focused heavily on ambush tactics. Rather than long-range bombardments, crews were instructed to wait until tanks close to effective range before opening fire, aiming for vulnerable points such as tracks or exposed structural sections. Although the 37mm attack arrived too late in the war to see widespread deployment or decisive impact, its significance lies in what it represented. It was the first purpose-built anti-tank gun ever fielded, and it laid the conceptual groundwork for later German designs in the interwar period, most notably the 37mm Pak-36, which would become a standard anti-tank weapon in the early years of the Second World War. In the end, Germany's first encounter with tanks was not a story of panic but of rapid adaptation. What began in 1916 as confusion on the battlefields of the Somme quickly evolved into one of the earliest organised attempts to defeat armour in warfare. From improvised field guns fired over open sights to steel core K bullets to bundled grenade charges thrown at point blank range, and finally dedicated anti-tank weapons with the arrival of the Tankgewehr M1918, the first anti-tank rifle ever made, and the 37mm TAC anti-tank cannon, German forces were forced to innovate in real time against a weapon that had never been used in warfare. I've been Lemon Cat, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch more First World War content, check out this video here, and if you want to look at the playlist of my other World War I videos, I will put this up here as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit that like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye now.